Welcome to High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by Andrew Hauser. Andrew graduated from the University of Kansas with a BS in athletic training in 2008 and obtained a master's degree of performance psychology in 2020. He's worked in a variety of roles in the past 14 years as an athletic trainer and strength and conditioning coach, with his most recent role being the Director of Performance Rehab with the Los Angeles Dodgers, during which he was a part of the 2020 World Series. He also served as a Director of Health and Performance for the Atlanta Braves, where he oversaw medical, strength, and integrated departments both in the major league and minor leagues, while continuing to develop and refining his colleagues' skills. He is currently in the private setting with Continuum Performance. It's an outstanding conversation. I met Andrew a long while ago in probably the mid-2000s at a PRI conference, and immediately was gravitated towards his knowledge. He's a Swiss Army knife in terms and measures of the rehab, the strength and conditioning, and the performance lenses in which he sees high development and high performance through. It's a really interesting conversation. We speak about his years of experience putting together a high-performance team. We talk about his current role in the private setting, the pros and cons in the private setting, the pendulum swings in high performance. Honestly, I feel like it was our second cigar and second bourbon, just getting back as old friends. I hope you really enjoy this hour. Very, very insightful. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, man. I'm happy to be here. This is the only way I feel like you and I get to catch up these days.
I know, man. You know what? We got to bring the listeners back to the days, man. What year was it that we attended the PRI all-inclusive?
I think that had to be 2000, you think 12?
Complete side note. You were, and you still are, one of the smarter guys that I know. I was completely drinking water through a fire hose that entire week. Like literally, I felt completely helpless in terms of my academic acumen, the everything during that entire week. But it was an awesome time for me to humble myself in terms of knowledge and create a new friend and a new colleague. So it's good that you're here. Super excited to spread a positive message and have our listeners learn about you and high performance in your lifestyle. So I'm going to start with this. I read through your bio before we got talking. I find this fascinating. I think it's pretty awesome. 2020, you went back to get a master's degree in performance psychology. So let me ask you this start question. Why the hell so late? I think it's awesome. I wanted to go back to get a PhD when I was 40. But why? And then why performance psychology?
Great question. So at the time I was like, all right, like realistically, I'm going to go back into being like a director that oversees, everything more or less. In LA, I was overseeing the rehab, but Atlanta, prior to that, I was overseeing strength medical and so on. And I looked at it like it's something I had a big passion about, the psychological side of things. I was lucky enough to work with whom I think is the best psychologist in the country. Maybe that's biased opinion, but I just think he's brilliant with how he looks at things. And for me, it was like, you know what? Like, I don't by any means need to be the expert, but I need, like, if I can have some basic conversations beyond what I can read online, and just, I think that was a good starting point. And then I also was, in my mind, using it as like, okay, that's also going to be my bridge to doing my PhD. Then you get in the private sector, as you've experienced, it's like, wow, do I actually have time for this? Maybe. I've gone back and forth on just going the academic route as well, but it's that's a whole other ball game. So
it's a humbling process. I heard this quote a long time ago. That's probably 10 years ago on a podcast. And Matt Jordan said something to this effect. And I remember it struck me so hard. I've said it several times in the podcast. The perception of the program may be more important than the program itself.
Right.
And I get that, whether you're a therapist or a strength and conditioning coach, no doubt in my mind, especially at the top of the cream of the crop. You worked in Major League Baseball for so many years. You worked with professional athletes from all backgrounds. if you don't know your stuff, sharks smell blood in the water. But having said that, you can know your stuff and nobody wants to spend an hour with you. The psychology element and their sales element is so critically important. I hate everyone, the sales, really? That's what we have to do as rehab conditioning specialists and strength coaches. What were some of your takeaways that you took with you, whether it was your mentorship during Major League Baseball or your academic pursuits in your master's program from that psychology route? Were there any that stood out and stuck out?
I'm more interested in these are really people I've come in contact with over the years, maybe books I've read and just things I'm drawn to, like the subtle behavioral influences that can make like huge impactful changes. I mean, and say whatever we want, but this is a perfect time to actually have this discussion with, like, I know the Democratic National Conventions right now, the elections coming up in November, like it's all propaganda, you know? So at the end of the day, that's what sales is too. At the end of the day, how do we promote the behaviors that we're trying to elicit more than anything, and the environment that we're trying to create through more subtleties? And that, I think, is the most powerful thing we can do. Again, I mean, we're seeing it play out. Like, I don't know if people care about issues or not right now with the election, but they're very emotionally drawn one way or the other. And that's the genius of some of the psychological warfare that's happening. That is really ultimately what intrigues me. And like, I mean, I wanted to know what made high performers, number one. I think this is kind of just a side note from myself, but I had a friend, this always struck me. This is like probably back in, man, 2013, 14, not around the time that you and I met, actually. And he had told me, he's like, hey, like, if you come across, but it was one of the owners of a team, he's like, crazy, man. Like, he remembers everybody's name. Like, he's like, it's really interesting. And that really struck me at the time. Like, okay, this guy's a billionaire realistically. And he's remembering, interns' names. He's remembering it was at that moment where I was like, man, I think every elite performer has something, they have a characteristic, like a psychological characteristic that makes them different. Because at some level, like, the field's pretty even. There's very few outliers that are just, they're physically and mentally just beyond everybody. And I mean, we see those, like, that's probably like Gretzky, he's better on both
Yep.
sides.
Touched by the hand of God. Yep. Not many of those. Those are generational, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Barry Bonds was that way. Whether we don't have to get into what people feel about doping, but he was better than everybody. What is it that makes these elite performers elite? And so everybody, I mean, whether they're successful on, like, from an athletic endeavor or a business endeavor, like, man, I want to try to figure out what it is that's different about them.
It was so interesting talking about this psychology. I remember, and I shared this story on a podcast, I think several episodes ago, but I remember this was probably, again, early 2000s. I was at a Perform Better seminar, and it was my first time hearing Dr. John Berardi speak. And I was so excited. I had my notepad. I'm thinking, this guy's going to talk about macronutrients. He's going to talk about the perfect diet. And literally, the entire presentation was all on psychology and small little habits that aggregate over time that make big changes. And it was at that point, as a young practitioner, I'm like, Jiminy Christmas. Wow, that's powerful stuff. I also remember reading more recently the book Atomic Habits, and sometimes some of this is common sense. I get it, but this idea of changing the environment or creating the environment. And it comes back to another quote that I always like to say, at least in the coaching realm. And I think it's the same with, physical therapy as well. But great coaches are a lot like gardeners. Gardeners don't grow flowers. They create an environment for flowers to grow. I like that. And I know in therapy too, I even look at some of the things like IFAST, like Bill Hartman, the color of the room, the pictures on the wall. Like, these things are all psychological, and they affect, whether you believe it or not, whether it's complete placebo or not, they matter. And I would imagine in high performance, it comes down to millimeters. And if that can help, why not do it, right?
Yeah. Details matter at the end of the day. I remember this is when I was with another club, and this was a guy that was like, some of it he was like, I know he wanted to keep his job and he was worried about those things. So I take that into account. But I remember him saying, and he'd been around for a while, and he's like, man, you worry, you concern yourself too much with like details. And it's like, oh, okay. Maybe I need to take a step back and think of this. But the flip side of that is like, maybe you don't worry enough about them. And I was like, that's probably why this isn't the right environmental fit for you. And that has nothing to do with somebody's job performance, in my opinion. It's just certain environments, we're good in them, we're not good in others. And that's why I think we're drawn to different things. But I remember, I don't know if you've heard of Toto Wolff. He's the Mercedes Formula One. I don't know if he's the team owner or what. We'll call it the director, but like he's the owner. And I remember reading an article about him when he first got to Mercedes. Like he was talking to the cleaning people about things in the bathroom, like details in the bathroom of how he wanted like in the waiting area, how he wanted the magazines or books to be that were out. It's like, and then they went on to win like 7 or 8 straight Formula One championships. Again, there's a variety of things, but it just again goes back to, and John Wooden did the same thing. They talked about him spending a day just on putting on your socks correctly. It's like details are so immensely important. Like, man, sorry, this is kind of a rant, but I remember I was on a flight. I mean, who knows where we were going. This is when I was still in with the team. And I was watching it was a documentary about like perfume. I don't even know why, like how I started watching it, but they started talking about, it's just funny because you have to hear things at a certain time and be open to it. Um, they were talking about how like olfactory is like the most powerful sense, creates memories. And that was like a moment for me where I was like, man, that's a detail like none of us are ever paying attention to really in our world. Like I ended up actually getting a scent made for like our space because of that. And like, so I have little travel candles I'll give to the guys so they
Hey,
can
it
have,
makes sense, right? Retail does it. Abercrombie and Fitch, walk into a store.
right. Can't get the smell off of you.
Unbelievable. All right, I want to pivot. 14 years of experience, most current with the Dodgers as a director of performance rehab. Could you expand on duties, responsibilities? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, that was primarily over the major league, the 40-man roster, rehabilitation people. So, anybody that's going on the IL, any long-term rehabs, and then plugging that kind of back into the system as a whole. Because I mean, I was in LA for the day-to-day. So it was like we'd have some guys in LA. We'd also have some guys in Arizona at our spring training facility. Prior to that was Atlanta, where I was. That was honestly my dream role. There was some financial reasons actually we left because, amongst other things, like you can be on the player's pension. I was not on the player's pension in Atlanta, and LA I was able to do that, but Atlanta it was overseeing medical, strength, I mean, nutrition, psych, everything kind of fell under one umbrella.
And you
Um,
oversaw all of that, correct?
yeah, yeah. And that was, I mean, the whole goal of getting there was like, all right, like let's integrate our departments first, top level, and then have that and integrate major league and minor leagues. Because just how it was, and there's still teams like this in a lot of sports. Everything was just kind of very siloed. There wasn't a lot of oversight with the major league and minor league, or not oversight, overlap between the major league and minor leagues at that point. And the environment I had come from was the opposite of that. And even the people I've been mentored along the way, I've just been consistently the opposite of that. So yeah.
Integrate, sexy word. Uh, and I'm not expecting you to give me a detailed like underneath the hood. That's got to be a challenge. So it's a question that obviously I didn't email you, so it's not off the cuff. But how do you do that? Like, how is the goal to eventually, obviously get everyone speaking under the same roof? I read a book a little while ago. Gosh, I just said on just the previous podcast, Doug Lemoff. It's all on coaching, and I forget the name of the
I,
book. It's gonna
I know the book you have. I have it on my bookshelf, actually.
it's gonna drive me nuts. But one thing he said, he talked about forming a team, or in this case, like a club model, right? He said you want to have some sort of shared curriculum, you want to have the principles that guide it, and then you want to have shared terminology. Okay. Now, I don't know if that is similar to you trying to construct this, because I'd imagine that before this, and everybody talks about this, we're going to integrate the doctors and the rehab and the strength and conditioning. How did you do that?
That's a great question. This stuff gets me pumped up. So going in like to Atlanta specifically, like I had this, vision of like, hey, here's kind of our roadmap, this whatever. I think I had it broken into like a 3-year process to start. Some of that you just have to you have to have guidelines, but it's going to change. You have to remain fluid, which 100% has been the same thing when I've gotten in the private space. I would say a couple things had to happen right away. Like we had to get stability in some key roles. So it had to get right people in the right positions. And then from there, it was some simple, like some subtle things like, hey, like we're all wearing, these are the clothes we're wearing together. These are like, here's our course construct, like started putting together our coursework. Actually, after that first season, we got the entire, like we call it the leadership kind of group together. And we had like a dinner where we whiteboarded the whole time. Like it was a long dinner of like, hey, like what do we believe in? Like there's no right or wrong, just shout stuff out. And like so we had like this board of all this stuff, like, okay, like how many of these are the same? Like that's how we developed like as a group rather than it just being me. Like that's how as a group we developed our vision, I mean, all of the things that you're just discussing from that book, honestly. And then off of that, it's like, okay, now we can really start to hone in. Okay, these are the things we said as a group are our like pillars of what we believe in. Like, all right, how are we filling these buckets educationally? And building out the educational process of that, I think was key. Because that's what I would tell people when we would be talking to them for an interview. Like, hey, like I want you ultimately either to take my role, my job, or like I want you to be able to take the role you want, wherever that is. But I can tell you teams are going to be calling for our people, and they're not going to know you right now. It's going to be word, it's going to be like they're going to say like, hey, like who do you have? But they're calling specifically for like principles. So these educationally, like these are going to be our principles. Get good at these, and then I want you to do what you want. And kind of how we ran the educational process then was like, hey, again, these are our main things. So we would, they'd need to spend their education money on those things. Once they had fulfilled all of those, then, hey, spend it on whatever you want. But we were always bringing in those things as well. Like we'd have, I think, 2 in off season where one was just, hey, this is just part of our educational curriculum. And then we'd bring in something that, hey, this is something kind of to whet their appetite of like, this is becoming a bigger thing. Like we brought in like Eldoa one off. And we did a few things like that just to say like, hey, like once you get through this curriculum, like just keep your eye on this. Man, the educational part was huge. We would start interviewing was big. So we wanted everybody, because again, wanted people that were leaders ultimately. So young trainers, young strength coaches, they would be interviewing interns. They'd be part of the interview process. The higher level ones was more like if it was like a coordinator or a major league job, that was more of a select group, but it was everyone that was essentially a decision maker within the department. But there were always you were always preparing for the role ahead of you, and then you were trying to develop the person below you to take your role.
So whiteboarding, this was shared among strength, PT, uh, 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 director of performance, everyone in the same room. So there's a people and there's a purpose element to it. You mentioned getting the right people in the train. I'd imagine that means getting some people off the train. Uh, was that a difficult process? Is it just one of those deals where you have to sit down with somebody and say, hey, thank you very much for your service here. It's we're moving in a different direction, and as a consequence of which, I'm sure those weren't easy conversations either.
No, no, and I mean, you have relationships with a lot of those people. The the hope is always like the environment kind of figures them out, and so sometimes people leave on their own because of that. That makes things easy, but that's easy for us because then we don't have to have the difficult conversation. You know? But ultimately, and there's things I would definitely do different in this capacity now, like looking back at it, like I certainly fumbled around a few things in that, but yeah, you got to have hard conversations whether you want to or not. And that's ultimately a mentor of mine. I remember saying, is like, man, I'm not confrontational, but I know my role. Like, I'm in this role to have those conversations. That stuck with me of like, okay, yeah, it's these aren't fun, but hey, the more you just hit them in the head. And again, I think I would do things slightly different now, but hindsight's 2020. And because again, goes back to what we were saying earlier, like, and I'm not the right fit in every environment, like I always thought I was a chameleon. And I knew in Los Angeles, as an example, like characteristic wise and like things that I valued didn't necessarily align with some things that were as a whole. That's fine. That's going to be the case with a lot of places. And so like I wasn't the right fit in that environment. But Atlanta, I was different because it's like, okay, like we are creating this as a group.
Today's episode has been brought to you by Physical Preparation for Ice Hockey, Biological Principles and Practical Solutions, and the Gain Go Grow Manual. This is a 2-part book series exploring training the intermediate and advanced level players. Book number 1 explores training the intermediate player. Chapters include long-term athletic development, considerations, speed training, power training, strength training, and program design. The Gain Go Grow Manual explores training the high-performance hockey player. Chapters include biomechanics of ice hockey, considerations for high performers, minimizing adaptational risks while upsizing gains, the Gain Go Grow model, and example microcycles. More information can be found at Amazon.com. Let me ask you this question, going with your Dodgers experience. I'd imagine that's also difficult too, when you step into a position like that where there's already people there, right? Yeah. And it's like the new guys here. Well, hey, we got to be on our best behavior, or I mean, whether there's. I'm not saying this is the case because every team's different and every person's different. But is that an element where you really have to, continue to communicate openly, but also, it's not making changes immediately, and it's slow, gradual changes over time, and slowly getting to know people and building that communication where, you might want to make all these changes day one in your head, where you're like, okay, Andrew, slow down a bit. Like you're gonna rub people the wrong way, or you're gonna have a lot of resistance if you go about it that way.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. I think that like Atlanta, I went about things. Some things I probably almost did too quickly. On that note, um, and then there are a lot of things you got to slow drip. I think laying out your expectations clearly from day one is important. And like, hey, here are the things like that you're essentially going to be like from a performance review perspective. Like everyone's at the end of the day, like that first year, like everyone's being audited more or less. And like, let's just get the elephant in the room. Like, let's get it out in the open. Like, but at the end of the day, like, I think values are one of the more important things, and those shine through in the course of a long season. Your values become apparent, and that's every one of us. And again, so like that's when you really start to see, well, where things like going to be able to coexist from that perspective. That's even like where we took some of the interview process when I was in Atlanta, and then I took pieces of that over into LA as well. Was we were looking to stress them out, so we got who they really were before we even started asking the more traditional questions. Like they had a process they went through where it's like, all right, you can't fool anybody now, because that's what you want to see. That's who you're going to work with every day. That's when you're stressed, like you're going to get calls from the front office or the manager. You're going to have tough conversations with them as well. And like, are you going to flip out and like just unravel, or what? You have to see those things, and I think this even maybe brings up a larger point that I think I may disagree with some people on this, or people may disagree with me on it. Man, you spend so much time with the people you work with in a professional sporting environment. I've always heard like, you don't have to be best friends with them. Like, man, like I disagree, because like like this all boils down to trust at the end of the day. Again, if I'm coming in and you don't know me, you're not going to trust me. We don't have a relationship. Um, as we develop a friendship, like a friendship is built on trust. Like, so if we don't have to be friends, then how are we ever going to trust one another? There have been professionals I've worked with that I have professional respect for, but we were certainly not friends. And like, so there's always a guarded, like those conversations are guarded because of that.
100%. 100%.
That's not good. That's not good for the whole team, in my opinion. And I think you start to see that when you know where to look.
Yep. All right. I want to pivot once again off to the private sector. This is awesome, actually. I've got a lot of questions. Continuum Performance. And not that you didn't have skin in the game when you were taking these high-end jobs in Major League Baseball, but you eat what you kill in the private sector now, right? Like it's a little bit different. Everything, from technology procurement, you're paying for it. Give me 10 1080 sprints. Yeah, when you have a budget that looks like my hairline, you might be towing a sled, right? So there's a lot of things that go on in the private sector. I guess number one, why the move to the private sector? And number two, what do you see now in reflection, the pros and cons are to that?
Yeah. Great question. There's a lot of layers to that. It was 2020 when we started thinking about like, man, I don't know that I want to be in anymore. Some of it was just COVID. That whole year it felt like 3 seasons in one. And I know our schedule was super condensed. And so people are like, that was, whatever, 60 games, then the playoffs. Just because everything that went into that, it literally felt like 3 seasons in one. And then, I mean, the last 2 months of the season, we were in a hotel. Like, okay, I'm going to see my wife for, 2 months. And so, but like when I reflect on that, it's like, man, I was so just like burnt out, which I think a lot of people can relate to at this point. But that's when I started thinking like, man, that was the first time I've been like, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. And then like in my opinion, and maybe I'm different than others, I can't speak for everyone. Like when those thoughts creep in, like it's a snowball effect. So let's see, after 21, that was the end of my deal. That's when my wife and I were like, all right, we had found out she was pregnant. We were trying to figure out what we wanted to do at that point. I had thought about the academic side. I thought about another sport. I thought about doing the private piece. And I had someone I knew reach out that was like, hey, I've got this athlete, like he's going through this issue. I can't go out and see him. Would you mind? I was like, oh, this could be, let's see what it's all about. Different sport. And that was something that it's funny because I was in baseball forever, but I never viewed myself as a baseball guy. I was clearly a baseball guy. So I started going down that road, and I was like, man, like I think this is it, because not because of the client per se, but more the like one of the frustrations of pro sports is like you're never really able to run your A plan. Very rare. And it's more honestly, it's like if you get a C plan happening, like that's usually a win. So that was a frustration. And then like, man, creating your own schedule, that's a whole other thing. That was like a light bulb moment. It's like, man, if the schedule sucks, like that's on me. That's not on anybody else. Um, so started working with that athlete. It's like, man, like I'm able to like it reinvigorated me professionally. Like I can now start pulling in all the things like I truly believe in. I'm not having to play a political game anymore, which is a whole other.
We need another podcast for that.
Yeah. I literally had a phone call this morning with a friend that was like, I mean, it's late in their season, so he just had to unload some stuff. But it's like, yeah, man, like that stuff like wears you down. So starting to put those things into place, I was like, well, this is amazing. So it's like, how deep can you take things? How deep do you want to take things? And that was again reinvigorating for me, because I was like, man, they're paying you for what you do and what you bring, rather than like when you're with the team. This is one thing that I've thought about a lot since I've been out. And you talk about pros and cons. No matter how good your staff is, man, I've been on a staff who I consider probably from the medical side of things, probably the best in all of pro sports, at least in the United States. And like I look at that, and super integrated group. But I look at that and like, man, I know how elite they are. Like players will always look at that as like it's like staying at the Westin. Westin is a great hotel. Don't get me wrong. It's a 4-star hotel. You know what you're gonna get. But like players, when they go outside, whether right or wrong, are always going to look at that outsider as like the Four Seasons. That's what they're looking for.
Real quick, reminds me of a quote. I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's a Dan Paff quote, and he said, "You're never the guru in your own area code." Hey, by the way, whether that area code's a Weston across the street or a whatever, but there's always, hey, I got to get this guy. I got that guy. So, anyways, I didn't mean it. I just thought it was a funny quote because I see it all the time.
100% the case. And frankly, that's why it's, I think, good to have a big network too across the country, because then you can follow these people. But I think that was an eye opener for me. And certain sports are different, like not from that perspective, because I think every sport's a little better at something, like as a whole. Like it's like I think like baseball is probably a little better on the manual therapy side of things, you know. Hockey, I think, is probably one of the more, with the strength side, I think it does one of the better jobs, to be honest. Football, it's just part of the culture of like training. So they will pretty much do what they ask as well. It's just a little different. But again, every sport's different. Soccer does a great job as far as like particularly the strength staff having like are being integrated into the coaching staff, and like helping develop practice plans and whatnot. But I digress. Um, those things like on the outside now, it's like I would do things different on the inside because of now what I've learned. But I wouldn't have known these things if I hadn't been on the inside. You know, like frankly, I would leverage the outside people a lot more. Like football, basketball, a little bit in hockey, a little bit in baseball. Like in season now, they're looking for kind of their own people, not just the off season. That's, I think, been a tough progression. And I've been in a role where it's like, man, you get a little territorial when you have these outsiders coming in. The strength side has actually done the best job of that because they've had to deal with it forever. The medical side hasn't really had to do that too much. And now it's become a little territorial. I think it's getting better. But that is something now, like being on both sides, that frankly, I would do that. And that's what, when people call me like, hey, I'm thinking about taking this role, that's one of the things I tell them. I was like, man, leverage the people on the outside, like get good people in there. Even if you think you can do this better, like when you bring in outsiders, like guys, you get trust from more trust from the players, but it also, then you start to develop a network of say like, hey, like you're going to be living in Columbus, Ohio this summer, man. I've got an awesome person for you to go be with. Like if they're not going to do what you really want them to do, then like send them to somebody that you know is like really good. And like even if you don't totally like, again, it becomes HIPAA things and whatnot, maybe you can't even know totally what they're doing, but they're going to be running a much higher offense than the flip side of that if like you're just trying to tell them what to do and it's a hope and prayer. Especially when you start looking at deeper dives, like when they start looking at like, hey, getting super deep into their medical, like their blood work and just kind of optimizing their health on this end. Or again, there's so many layers to this. That's where I think there's a huge opportunity for good people to rise kind of to the occasion, but also for the teams to take advantage of that and take advantage of it for the betterment of the player, because that's ultimately what this whole thing's about.
Yep. Yep. So true. I like that advice, by the way. And I think as a young coach, I would point the thumb and say I was a territorial person. And I really have been humbled year over year. I think we all get humbled as we age, and experience comes at the user's expense. I think it's great now. And I think, every person that I have interviewed at the National Hockey League level, and they say there's, they say, hey, especially with a lot of the older players, like, obviously they're gonna have their own people in the summers, and there's got to be a cooperative approach. It can't always be me, because then you lose that trust that you talked about. But so I looked at your website. I want to go through this fictitious case study. It doesn't have to be too in depth, okay? But I want to talk about, you talked about treatment, performance, virtual consulting, and rehab. So I want to hit two. I want to hit treatment and performance, okay? In the continuum business. So Anthony Donskoff comes in. I'm a hockey player. And I'm reading, this is a quote, whole body assessment geared towards identifying joint and muscular imbalances and specific tissue oxygen utilization. So that is the tail end of that really caught me. I think I know what you're using to do that, because you and I have talked on the back end. So walk me through, if I'm coming in and we can make a fictitious injury. It doesn't have to be. Maybe I have a bad hip. I have FAI and I'm thinking about getting a surgery. I'm coming in for the first time. What does that look like from a treatment standpoint in terms of your assessment? I know it's kind of variable. I'm not expecting you to be tied down to certain assessments, but maybe there are. And then that tissue oxygen utilization. Walk me through that.
You fly out. I take it very simply on the table to start with, and there's a lot of PRI undertones to the initial part of the on-table assessment. A lot of passive joint range, looking at foot strength. I'm looking at a number of things, but off of that, it's like, okay, this is telling me I'm looking at spirometry, looking at actually systemic CO2 levels.
Is that done with a spirometer? Like that you're blown? Like is that?
The CO2 levels are done. I'd use a spirometer there's 4 measures I look at with that. For CO2 levels, I use a capnometer, and I actually compare that nostril wise, and I go nostril to nostril. So if you've had injury, actually, those look strikingly different side to side, which is interesting. Whole other thing. But like after doing this for so long, like you have your norms of like
I was just going to ask that.
where are professional athletes and
There you
like compared to like your general pop. And then when they start falling into these different categories, like outside those norms, like what does that usually look like? Like there's certain things on the table that it's like, man, I don't know why this is, but like it doesn't matter what the sport. If somebody has passive hip abduction under 40 degrees, like that's a flag for me. And I'm not saying like one side or the other, that's a flag. Both sides, definite flag. As that gets higher, those athletes tend to be better on the field of whatever sport they're in, which again, it's like every sport too.
How do you measure that? Supine, sitting? How do you
sideline? So
sideline.
like hips, Bottom leg flex to 90, bottom hip flex to 90, and then straight
Got it.
straight
Got
line
it.
with their butt.
Yep.
That's a whole other thing. Like, then can they control that? That's a different discussion from a strength perspective. Going to look at force plates, going to look at, now when we talk about tissue oxygenation, if they're semi healthy, if they're just coming in for a general assessment, I'm gonna do a test on the bike actually that will start to give me a general sense of like how they systemically are utilizing oxygen or doing different things. Now, that's going to tell, I'm really looking at their cardiac system at that point, their muscular system, their respiratory system. We could talk about some psychological stuff or metabolically some different things, but those are like the three main ways, like looking at like oxygen utilization and delivery, looking at tidal volume and respiratory frequency, looking at stroke volume and heart rate. So we have a compensator and a limiter of all those systems, and then I'm looking for the main limiter of all those. Beyond that, like if they have an active injury, that's when I will use a Moxie, and it'll give me an idea of like where they are in their recovery process, or if they're just kind of stuck at that moment. Injured tissue does not utilize oxygen. And when we have, this is a huge one for me, when we have an active injury going on, I mean, when we have any sort of injury, so surgical, non-surgical, yeah, we tear muscular tissue, we tear vascular tissue, and like, well, yeah, no wonder a muscle strain, like it can't use oxygen. How am I feeding that? And this goes back to even like what Verkhoshansky was saying, like where he started. He started on rebuilding the vascular system when he would work with people. I didn't realize that he was doing that, I think, until later on, or I'd forgotten it, didn't, whatever. I'd probably just glossed over it. But I started seeing that with Moxie like over and over again. And then like, oh, okay, this is kind of important. So most athletes, that's where I'm starting them, is like, how do we, essentially, we're just trying to get more angiogenesis. Like we're trying to create as robust a vascular system as we can. Because that adds performance potential, but that adds recovery potential.
I talked to Brian Kozak, and you were the one that had turned me on to him. And he talked about the use of utilization and delivery, and training the various systems. This angiogenesis. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you measure this and manage it. That angiogenesis, that's more of the peripheral aspect in the tissue, correct? So we can get that. If we're a strength coach, we can get that with slow tempo training, occlusion. We can also, I know they make them now, they're making them more feasible than ever. We can do that with blood flow restriction. Is that correct as well? And then if it's a delivery issue, then we're working more the heart, right? The eccentric cardiac hypertrophy. Or am I wrong in that?
The last part, like partly yes. Now, fully, some of it is starting to teach the tissue to relax faster. And that's one of the ways you can do it, to get that essentially filling up with oxygen. Think about filling up a gas tank, really. I'll do that. Do that with the pool, do that. You could do that with a walk. You could do, and that's the eccentric part that you're talking about. The bike is an interesting one because it takes velocity to drive that up. You can also do that with nasal breathing, which is fascinating. Just nasal breathing, and you get that similar response. There's so many roads that lead to Rome. This is one of the things that really drew me to the Moxie was like, man, now it's like, if I have the intent of what I want to do, it's just really about my creativity as a coach, number one. And I think beyond that, what will the athlete do for you? Like, okay, like if like I want to do some like breathing protocol, the guy's not going to do that. Okay, like, well, you'll get in a traditional sauna probably if we have that available. You'll do BFR. Maybe go back and like, hey, let's do some of like Veringa Embedded's body circuits, or like we're doing all these things, same things, or go to Val Nasedkin's like oxidative work. Like all these things they're going about it slightly differently, but the larger intent, like not getting into like fiber type and this, that, and the other, the larger intent remains the same.
Let me ask you this question. I wrestle with this. Like I'm a very big skeptic, and when I say skeptic, I don't mean like I don't look at it and be a pessimist. That's not what I mean. I think it's interesting because, like I said before, skin in the game. You're using your own money for this, right? There's a lot of people that just collect and share on social media. I'm not saying anyone that's listening. That's not what I mean. But I'm just saying, like, the big thing is technology. We have Hawking Dynamics. Service is next to none awesome. Like, I love it. We focus on three metrics. Literally. There's freaking 75. Like, you can spend one day on a jump. Okay. Here's what we focus on, and it's a combination. We've changed over the years, learning from people like Matt Jordan and the other gentleman out of the UK. And I'm kicking. I should have him. He publishes a ton of stuff on the force plates. At any rate, performance, just jump height. We look at time to takeoff, and we look at left to right propulsive and braking impulse. And we found, even with our healthy players, in some capacity, 15 to 20% of our roster has a greater than 15% asymmetric.
Yeah.
I struggle with it, meaning now, is that a good metric? Is that a bad metric? And I realized too, I talked to Patrick Ward, and Patrick always tells me, well, is the metric even reliable, Anth? And which makes my head spin, which makes my head spin even more, right? And he talks about this idea of the observable score is the true score minus the error. The error typically doesn't come from the machine, right? Like assuming that it's calibrated, it comes from the way the test was administered. Is it the right time of day? Which is impossible to do in the applied setting. So as you can see, the hamster wheel starts spinning even more. I guess my question for you is, after all the years that you've been doing it, is there certain metrics that you like on the plate? And if so, like, why and what are they?
Yeah, I think we're looking at most of the same things on um, the left and right specifically for me um, are fascinating, because I think you start to see, man, I need to train his left leg different than I need to train his right leg. Frankly, that happened this past off season with an athlete of like, and this was he didn't have an injury at the time, but he's like, man, he had a number of like soft tissue injuries. It's like, well, okay, like it's like you can't even absorb force very well on one side compared to the other. Like you absorb well, but it's like we're not getting that like quick, like elastic response that we want. So I think that goes back to like, you got to take a step back, even when it's not sexy, to ultimately propel that athlete forward. I'm with you though. It's like the longer I've done this, and I remember people saying this when I was younger, but some of these conversations we're having sound so complex, but like you go back to basic principles and you do very basic things with them. It's just the depth underneath, like why you're doing those things is totally different. But man, I remember, I'm sure a lot of people have said it, but it's like the more elite someone is, in my opinion, the more they do the basics. And it's truly just, they've got more depth to why they're doing the basics than we do. And like when we're younger, we're trying to do the next best thing. Now it's like, man, when I learn something new or get an idea, it's like, okay, well, how can it drive the response I'm looking for? Because then like, okay, like we can use that. It could have a place.
Another Patrick Ward for me: adaptation, method, exercise, or means. What's the adaptation I'm looking for?
I love that you said that. I should write that down actually. Yeah, but
Hey, there's one thing maybe you picked up from me today, and it's Patrick Ward's.
But that's truly though, like that's what we're all after at the end of the day, is like what, and that's even like going back to the Moxie. Like the Moxie sounds complicated, it looks kind of complicated on the front end, but it's just looking at the intent of your adaptation. And I think in sport and in the private sector, a lot of people, they don't have a clear intent. It's like they've lost their true north. They have an idea like, you just need to feel better, or we're doing X today, we're doing Y. Like, okay, well, that's why I like monitoring certain things, because like, all right, now we know, like, that's what we're driving.
It's crazy, to make the force plate thing even more confusing to me. I had the opportunity to interview several times. This guy's a genius. I love the guy. Proud to call him a colleague and friend. Mal McHugh, just like super brilliant researcher. Did a ton of stuff on the NHL Combine, and he's doing a ton of research on plates. He said, "Anth, I don't look at the numbers. I just look at the curve." He said, "I just want the picture." He said, "To me, it's like an EKG of the heart." He said, "I just want to look at the before and after pictures and see what I'm going after. Where is that? Different portions of that curve. Where are they? And now what does it look like? Is it before injury? Now what does it look like after injury? Is it after the injury? Now he's rehab for 12 months. But I want to look at the EKG in air quotes, or the curve, as opposed to the numbers." He said, "The numbers don't mean much to me." And I'm like, wow, okay. It's just another way of looking at it, right?
Yeah, which I respect that, and like, I agree. In a lot of the private sector, you can have that thought process. That's more challenging now in the team sector, depending on the sport.
Yeah.
Again,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
baseball is not going to care about like a squat number or something in the weight room, but like college football, like your coach probably wants to see that stuff. Or right now, like it's top speed that they're hitting on the practice field a lot of times. But
I remember too. Oh man, you need to read this book if you haven't. And again, it's just my skeptical mindset, but it changed the way I think, and it has nothing to do but everything to do with performance. It's called The Tyranny of Metrics. It's an unbelievable book, Tyranny of Metrics. And I'm just paraphrasing some of the things that he writes down. He talks about like what are the time constraints, meaning, what is my trade-off between time and analyzing this data? Okay. Why does it matter? And he talked about piggybacking on time. He said, really, in a lot of things, it's what you want to measure, or what you want to look at are the outliers. And the way I look at metrics right now, too, is that most of the time, again, my field's a little different. I only have 12 weeks with guys in the summer. So monitoring is not really, I just want to look at, and if I were to use it in a team setting, and I'm saying, great, Anthony, you're not in that right now, I get it. But I would more want to look at that. Here are my baseline. Once the outlier occurs, which is an injury, I want to be able to use that, like catapult, for example. Like, I think that's valuable information. Can you reinforce that with a good coaching eye? Probably more than likely. But can you use that objective information if someone gets injured with an ACL or an MCL to create a return to play? I find more value in that than just, probably just, on the daily. Now, I understand that you could probably put those numbers together and get a 7-day, a 21-day rollover and look at total volume and talk to a coach about that, a coach that's willing to listen. And I get that. But for me, a lot of the stuff is who doesn't belong, meaning like, who are my outliers? The injury, or you just collect baselines and you're like, wow, that guy is an outlier in a good way, or that guy is an outlier and he's off the charts in a negative way. Does that make sense?
no, absolutely. That's why I think, again, it goes back to like, you really have to have athlete trends. And then like when you get into a sport, like you have sport trends, and you also have position specific trends that you see. And then you want all of your, I think, athletes you work with to at least be within the bell curve of whatever sport. Like, again, my NFL linemen I work with are going to look different than it's going to be a different bell curve
Yeah, 100%.
But there are also specific qualities that I think all athletes need, that I think are now starting to get overlooked. Some of it's time, and some of it's just like, it's not sexy right now too. But I think you need a baseline to be able to go back to. Moxie makes things interesting. This is a little curveball where it's like, it's not going to be the same every day. So like, this would go back to Patrick of like, well, was the test even valid if it's different every single day? But that's part of being a human, and you're just doing the best you can with the information you have too. I think there's a level of that, and as you develop a trend with an athlete, even if like, hey, like this was lower on this day or that day, like you still have the general trend of what you need to accomplish, and you have something to go back to and compare.
The hardest people to do any research on, or any kind of, I don't care whether it's controlled, I don't care whether it's experimental, I don't care whether it's observational, is the human being. There's so many working parts. And I always go back to another quote that I love. Epictetus is a Stoic quote. No man has ever stepped in the same river twice. He's not the same man, and it's not the same river. Everything changes. Like, I made terrible mistakes with HRV. Are you kidding me? Like, we had our wrestlers, like Olympic wrestlers. I thought, I knew the answer to everything. And a red came up and it was like, wow, we're shutting things down, guys. And the reality is, like, so many things can contribute to that. And that's what I mean about trying to standardize things, making decisions, not being an alarmist, collecting things over time so you know what is good. I think a lot of times right now is we're so everybody, it's like this show and tell. We got this. Great. What are you doing with it? How does that move the needle? Why does it matter? Another thing that always comes back to me is a conversation I had with another performance coach in the National Hockey League, and it stood out to me. Is it interesting or important?
That's
Right,
great.
right. There's a
Yeah.
lot of interesting things.
Interesting.
Is it important? And then the last thing that comes back to me, as National Hockey League coach said, is how does it help the player? How does it help the player? And you got to think of that stuff, before you invest in this stuff. I find it interesting. Last pivot. The pendulum right now in comprehensive care. Where is it swinging? Are we in a good place? Are we in a bad place? Where are we?
I think it's in an okay place right now. I do think the aerobic system is starting to get some appreciation again, which I like. That's Peter Tia's probably a lot of his work talking about zone 2. I don't think people necessarily know how to go about it, but at least it's that discussion started. If there's one thing I've seen in pro sports is like it's GPP work and just appreciation for what the aerobic system's really doing that's fallen off big time. Especially, I mean, coming from the baseball world, I saw the trend of that starting to go away. And pro sports people always talk about baseball specifically. They'd always say, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Okay, yes. It's more like an ultra marathon though. And I think all sports are a little bit like that. All professional sports, because the season is so long, it's there's nuances clearly in every game, but like your ability to recover every single day is what allows you to perform consistently. And what allows us to do that is our aerobic system. So, okay, you can accomplish building the aerobic system in a lot of different ways, but I don't think, again, people know how to do like some fundamental things or aren't appreciating that anymore. Getting better, still has a ways to go. There's still some territorial things happening that I'd like to see continue to some walls get broken down. I think more and more athletes now are looking for their own team, support team, or a performance team, whatever you want to call it. I think that's a pretty interesting trend that it's gonna kind of swing back and forth on that. Like, again, the team's getting less control.
Yeah, I think that can be a really good thing. I think it can also be, just depending on who you're with, which is probably scary as hell.
Yeah. I think it can go both ways. I think there's going to be some good, some bad. I do think in those situations, I think the athlete they're the athlete, it's their career. Don't get me wrong. But that doesn't mean they're the best performance director for themselves. And I think, again, they have to have the right relationship with a person that they'll listen to. Most athletes spend so much time on social media. It's really easy to swing with like the sexiness of this or that or the other, rather than some pretty basic things that may not seem sexy but are paying big dividends. So I think it's in an interesting place right now, and some of that's just social media. I think having so much access to so much information, that's not demonizing to social media, because I think some of that's great. Some of it is like you've got like there's some tried and true things that you need to, as a coach or a therapist or whatever, that you need to feel good about and have seen the ins and outs of, not I read this research article, so now like I understand
Oh,
this.
big time.
Uh, so overall good place, but there's still some, again, it's like the human body, like it's allostatic. So there's an ebb and flow here that's changing some things here, and it's just kind of you almost can't get too caught up. You need to understand the trends that are happening in the world, like the performance world. Again, it's like me going back and getting my uh the performance psych degree. I want to understand it well enough to have a conversation, but I don't need to be the expert in that. I just need to know the adaptations I'm trying to drive. So don't get caught in fluff.
Big time. You know, it reminds me of another bit of wisdom that I got from Dan Paff. I call it the Swiss Army knife. And he said, Anthony, you know, you want to have a basic knowledge of all of these without digging too deep. He said, I call it the 4 P's and a B. And hopefully I remember all these: psychology, programming, physiology, physics, and biomechanics. He said, if you can understand that basics, like the you know, physics in return to play, whether you're a strength coach, a long lever, short lever, torque, physiology, you know, adaptation. What are those adaptations? Method, means, programming. Can you put together a program? What matters for an elite player as opposed to a beginning player? Psychology. How do you sell the program? And then, you know, these are things, communication, I can go on and on about it, but if you can do those well, you can be a really good coach without having to dig so deep. Now, having said that, there's plenty of people that dig deep and or do all the other stuff well as well. But I thought it was really interesting. So,
I think as an industry, we do have to remember, and this is maybe like I don't know, I like where this part's going. Like we're not skill coaches either. Like yeah, we are, but like their sport specifically. So what I'm seeing in every sport right now is a loss in general qualities. Um, I think we could spend an entire offseason almost on GPP at this point. Maybe that's a gross over exaggeration, but I think like our GPP, our phase of that work needs to get longer and needs to expand more. Because I think those are the qualities that, again, and this is every sport, they're all playing travel sports growing up. You know, I can't believe how many high schoolers I'm hearing are just doing online class so they can train. The only people I knew doing that growing up were like, there were some elite gymnasts I knew. They were the only ones doing that. Now it's like becoming more the norm, which is mind blowing.
happening in hockey right now as we speak.
Yep. Yeah, I heard of soccer the other day, and like I know some college tennis players the exact same. And so that is happening. So I think as all these like sport specific trends are happening, we're losing the forest amongst the trees. So that's the part of the pendulum I'm not liking, because I think we have to remember what buckets we're trying to fill.
Our guest today has been Andrew Hauser. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, man.